We've powered the computer on, and this is called a BIOS information screen. This screen usually goes by very quickly, so we've pressed the pause break key to pause the boot process so we can take a look. We can see it's detected our CPU, the type of RAM, and the amount of RAM, as well as our 2 hard drives and our DVD drive. On your computer, if the system has trouble identifying your CPU or your RAM, it may stop here and ask you to press F1 to continue the boot process, or F2 or delete to go into the BIOS setup. On this computer, it's delete to go into setup. Before we go into the BIOS, we're going to continue the boot process and see what else comes up before we make any changes in the BIOS. We'll press any key. We can see a Marvel IDE controller coming up. This is an extra controller built into the motherboard. And there's also another Marvel controller coming up. We'll take a look at these in the BIOS. Okay, the boot process has stopped, and it's asking for a proper boot device or boot media. What this means is that it doesn't see an operating system to boot to. And at this point, you would normally put in your Windows install disk and start the installation process. Before we do that, we're going to reboot and go into the BIOS and make some changes. We can press Ctrl-Alt-Delete or the reset button on the computer to restart. We'll press Delete to enter the setup. It says we're going to enter. Here's the main screen of the BIOS setup utility. We can see that the system time and date are wrong, and we can set them using the minus and plus keys on our keyboard. But we're going to leave it alone, and we will set the time and date once we're installing Windows. It's also showing a legacy diskette A, which is a floppy drive, which we don't have installed in the computer. And we can either press minus and plus to change it, or press enter, which gives us a menu where we can disable it. It shows our 1 terabyte drive on the SATA 1 connection, our 250 gigabyte drive on the SATA 2 connection, and our DVD drive on the SATA 3 connection. And this matches up to where we connected the data cables from the drives to the controller on the motherboard. Now let's go over to the AI tweaker with the right arrow key. This is where you would come if you wanted to overclock your CPU. Now we're not going to get into overclocking in this video. Overclocking is a little more advanced than this video is intended to be. We're considering making an advanced set of videos that cover overclocking and RAID setup. Let's go over to the advanced page. Under the CPU configuration, there is a page of different features you can enable and disable. There's really nothing in here we need to change, so we'll back out by pressing Escape. And the same is true under the chipset. Nothing really that we need to change. So we'll back out. And under onboard device configuration, there are a few things. The first is the high definition audio. This is the sound that's built into the motherboard. And since we installed a Sound Blaster X-Fi sound card into a PCI Express slot, we need to disable the onboard sound. To do that, we'll press Enter and disable it. We also see the 2 Marvel controllers that are extra controllers on the motherboard. And right now, we don't have any hard drives or DVD drives connected to these controllers, but they do have their own separate BIOSes that start up every time the computer starts up, which slows down the boot process. So to save time every time we reboot or turn the computer on, we're going to disable both of the controllers. Now, if we ever do connect a drive to either of these controllers, we have to remember to come back in and re-enable them. There's also a Marvel LAN 1 and 2, which are the onboard Ethernet controllers. We'll leave both of those on, and the onboard 1394 controller, which is the FireWire controller built into the motherboard. We'll leave it enabled as well. We'll escape to back out. And also we have USB configuration and PCI PNP, and there's nothing to change in there, so we'll go over to Power. On this page, down at the bottom, we have the hardware monitor. If we go in there, we can see the CPU temperature, the motherboard temperature, the CPU fan speed, and the speed of the other fan that we connected to the motherboard. And we did connect this to the chassis fan 3 connector. There's also a Q fan control on the CPU and for the chassis fans. And if we enable that option, we can see we now have a CPU fan profile. What this does is when the computer is idling and the CPU isn't very hot, it will slow the speed of the fan down to make the computer a little quieter. Then once you get into Windows and the CPU is actually doing something, it starts to get a little bit warm. When it reaches a certain temperature, the fan will spin up to full speed so it can dissipate the heat. On some of the boards, you can actually select the percentage of the fan speed you want it to spin down while the computer's idling, and then the temperature where you want the fan to speed up to 100%. On this CPU, we're going to leave it as standard for now, and we may come in and play with that. And for the chassis fan, we're going to leave it disabled and let the fan spin at 100% speed. I think it's only 22 decibels, so we can barely hear it anyway. We'll press Escape to back out, and go over to the boot page. And in here we have the boot device priority. We'll go in there. And what this is the order of the drives that the computer will look to find an operating system to boot to. By default, our DVD drive is first. It's showing here as CD-ROM, but that's pretty common. If we press Enter, we can see it is a DVD. The second is our 1 terabyte SATA drive. So the way it is now, when we restart the computer, it will look for an operating system on the DVD drive, which will be the Windows install disk. If it doesn't find that, it will look for an operating system on the 1 terabyte drive. We'll back out of this and go over to Tools. And the first option is the Asus Easy Flash utility, and we can come here if we want to update our BIOS. On most motherboards, you can also update the BIOS in Windows. We'll go to the Exit menu, and here there's a Load Setup Defaults option that will put the BIOS back to a factory default, in case you want to start over. But we like the changes we've made, so we'll go to Exit and Save, and say OK. And you notice it didn't load the Marvel controllers, which sped up the boot process considerably. And it's saying that there's no medium in the DVD drive, which is true. We don't have the Windows install disk in. And going along with our boot priority, it then tried to boot to the hard drive, which of course is blank. In the next lesson, we're going to install Windows 7 onto the 1 terabyte hard drive.